So thank you all for joining. We are, as I say, recording, so we've got you all muted, and we will make this conversation available after this evening. I'm going to introduce myself briefly and a little bit about Rocha, the organization that's sort of hosting this talk and conversation, and then we'll dive right into some discussion with our panelists. My name is Matt Humphrey. I'm the Director of Theological Education for Rocha, and I'm grateful to be joining you in Zoom land here, but coming from the unceded lands of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, part of the Coast Salish here in Victoria, British Columbia. Lovely Victoria, where it is raining outside as it is wont to do. But I recognize you are joining us from across this great continent, and our panelists indeed joining us from other places. They'll perhaps tell you a bit about that. So let me express gratitude for those who have cared for this land that we all dwell on, past, present, and future, and gratitude for the opportunity to join together through this kind of crazy technology for a conversation across space and indeed time here. So welcome. Let me say a few words about Rocha Canada. Rocha is part of a global family of projects of Christians caring for creation. We do that in very hands-on, practical ways. We do that through working together in community, working in creative partnership with anyone who recognizes the world we live in as a place of wonder and delight and wants to try and care for it with whatever we can do. So we've been in Canada for probably almost 20 years now, and principally our work in Canada is located on 3 centers, one outside Vancouver, right near where Paul is located, one in Winnipeg, and one in Hamilton, Ontario. And in addition, there's a handful of partnered projects across the country of folks working and engaging, but we're in 20 countries around the world, and much more I could say about that to introduce us. If you're new to Rocha, please do check out the website, and when safety allows, please visit one of our centers. Now, my work as Director of Theological Education in particular is to try and help Christians and churches and Christian organizations think more deeply and perhaps even live more boldly into God's loving care for creation and our call to do that as image bearers of God. So it's a joy to be able to host this conversation as one little endeavor along that way. If you'd like to talk about what that might look like, if you have a church or an organization that will be interested perhaps in doing that, I'm available to chat with you and would love to do so. I'm going to pop my email into the chat. It should also be the email that's responded from the registrants, and you can use that to converse. So that's a little bit about me. These are Rocha Talks. This is our 5th talk. It's really an open dialogue about some of the core issues, indeed, both of our life of faith, but as it relates to our life in the world of creation and of being human creatures. And I'm excited because this is the first of these talks that's really kind of centering around a liturgical season within the Christian year. And this is Advent, more that we'll say on that. But we kind of look at this season to get us into this whole set of issues around how we live well, around how we live in this time and place and in this culture. And indeed, as we put in the title, this particular year, as we approach what is usually such a festive time and a joyous time, is perhaps a more grievous time, a more lonely time because of COVID and the whole set of factors that we've been living into for these many months. So we'll be unpacking a bit of that together. I'm delighted to have Elisa and Megan and Paul all joining us. You've read their bios. Elisa is a Peruvian-American filmmaker raised in Peru, studied in Vancouver, which is where she and I first met through a church community, and now living along with her partner and family in Columbus, Ohio. She's made some wonderful documentary films, very creative films that I highly recommend. Megan Crosby Shearer is a priest and a friend, a part of a community that I'm a part of here in Victoria. She has a passion for liturgy, for justice, for engaging how our faith story comes into life, and particularly doing that in this beautiful West Coast, along with her partner Rob and her twin children Amaya and Zion. And lastly, Paul Neufeld, who is the farm manager for Rocha in Surrey, where he and I worked together for many years. Paul works hard at farming, celebrates the wonder and beauty of vegetables and the limitless possibilities of soil, and watching folks get excited about flavors and challenges of seasonal eating. And Paul, you're joining us from Kingfisher Farm, which was the original Rocha Canada property in Surrey, where you live with your family and with 5 other families. So welcome to all 3 of our panelists. A delight to have you with us. So the format, I'm going to give each of our panelists a bit of a question to begin some dialogue. If you're a participant in this, please begin at any point to pose questions for our panelists in the chat as the conversation develops. My colleague Rick Fall will be managing that chat for us and sort of sifting some of those questions forward into what we hope is a very rich conversation. And I'll prompt you once or twice more to do that. If you have questions, feel free to do that through the chat. So Megan, I would like to start with you on this conversation. And full disclosure, as I say, we work together in ministry and our friends, but thinking about this title, Advent as Spiritual Resistance, would love your perspective, both as an ordained person, a priest, and someone really committed to liturgy. Start us off a bit about the season of Advent. How does this kind of situate the Christian year? How might you think about framing that liturgically? How does that connect to these deeper themes we've really put forward of resistance in this time?
Wow, okay. just a few light questions.
That's right.
Advent is one of my favorite seasons of our church year. I think it carries with it the opportunity to go deeper, to become more present in ways that I think we so desperately need at this time. But just to speak a little bit about Advent itself, you, wherever you are joining us from, you may know Advent more in terms of those chocolate Advent calendars that you got to open day by day as kids or even now. And that certainly was my first experience of Advent, and really made it then just a countdown to Christmas. Like, I get chocolate each day, and then I get to open my presents. Or maybe like the wreath, the Advent wreath behind us. So those are some of the kind of classic ways that Advent, at least in my early life, was represented. But the season is far deeper and richer than that. Some of our first mentions of it come in the early 400s. And scholars believe that during about the 4th and 5th centuries, this season wasn't at all a countdown to Christmas, but a season of preparation for baptism at Epiphany, when they marked this revelation, this light that was so focused as the Creator enters the creation, but that light is spilling out all over the world, is caught in glimmers on tree branches and in the lives of these people all over the world. And so that Epiphany, and was actually a period of 40 days of fasting, of prayer, of preparation, of really longing to embody, to incarnate this life. So it wasn't until the 6th century that was actually tied to Christmas. But again, the coming, the Advent, wasn't so much on that first coming of God into the creation in Bethlehem, but the grand coming, the coming again of God once more entering in to be with God's people, to renew the whole of creation, to wipe away every tear from every eye. That deep call and longing for the renewal of all things that we see in the longing for the second coming of Christ. So Advent was still an anticipatory, a preparatory, and not a like, let's just remember that baby one time, but let us live and embody it now in that hunger, that deep hunger for the renewal that we're expecting and that we're beginning to see, even if it's just in glimmers. So both of those aspects, that remembrance and that anticipation and that active waiting. So in terms of resistance, Matt, that you threw out there, how is Advent resistance? I think for me, all of our characters of Advent are characters that are unexpected. They're characters who in some way or other live a resistance against the dominant culture or are not the norm of what we might expect. So you have John the Baptist on the margins, not dressed in his Sunday best, calling people back to a life of authenticity, a life that actually captures the heart of who they are called to be, against some of the ways that religion has been co-opted by empire. And so you have this amazing character of John the Baptist. And then you have stories like Zachariah, a powerful religious figure who is silenced, and his wife, who is barren, conceives. You have all of these unfoldings of things that shouldn't be the way they are and yet become. And of course, for me, the amazing figure of Mary. Mary, a young woman, finding herself pregnant in the most unexpected way, facing shame, facing the risks of carrying a baby at this time, and saying yes to the most revolutionary thing of all, of God being born among us, that creator becoming flesh and blood, a vulnerable baby, a cranky toddler rocked to sleep by one of the most famous Advent songs of resistance, the Magnificat. These are the figures of Advent. And that, I'm just going to go off on a tangent on the Magnificat for a minute, because I think if we talk about resistance and Advent, that song, that hymn of Advent lifts up those who are struggling, who are weary, who have been exploited. And these words, the words of the Magnificat, have been so provocative that they've actually been banned in various places. So during the British rule in India, the singing of the Magnificat in church was prohibited, thought to be so inflammatory that it could not be spoken. During the 1980s, the government of Guatemala found the ideas raised by Mary's proclamation so focused on the poor, so dangerous and revolutionary that the government banned any public recitation of Mary's words. This is the kind of Advent resistance we're talking about. And it's captured a little bit. I wanted to read just this little piece from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a German theologian. And at the time when the persecutions were beginning, at an Advent sermon, he wrote this, and he says, "The Song of Mary is the oldest Advent hymn. It is also the most passionate, the wildest, and one might almost say the most revolutionary Advent hymn that has ever been sung. This is not the gentle, tender, dreamy Mary that we often see her portrayed in paintings. The Mary who is speaking here is passionate, carried away, proud, enthusiastic. There is none of the sweet, wistful, or even playful tone of many of our Christmas carols, but instead a hard, strong, relentless hymn about the toppling of thrones and the humiliation of the lords of this world, about the power of God and the powerlessness of humankind. This is the sound of the prophetic women of the Old Testament, Deborah, Judith, Miriam, coming to life in the mouth of Mary. God is not ashamed of human lowliness, but goes right into the middle of it, chooses someone or something as an instrument, and performs miracles right there where they are, where it's least expected. God draws near, loving the lost, the unnoticed, and the unremarkable, the excluded, the powerless, and the broken. These words of God calling us to prepare, to wake up, to notice, to be present to the God who is most present to the vulnerable. So amazing. So that's part of what I love about this season. And the other thing that I love is that it calls us out of the rush. It calls us out of the frantic pace and actually asks us, what if we slowed down? What if we actually felt the earth change under our feet as winter comes? What if we actually noticed the change in the air, or stopped and prayed with a tree that has been scarred by our human greed or our human neglect, and actually just stop there for a bit and notice that God is incarnate there, now and always, and to be. So there you go. That's some of me.
Thank you, Vegan. That's lovely, lovely bit of history and helpful framing. And I want to pivot really to you, Elisa, now, thinking about these themes, and particularly, I think, hearing in that, these figures that we get John the Baptist and Isaiah, and we get even Mary, and these are folk who do speak from places of marginality, often against something of an establishment. And what I've known of you as a filmmaker and a storyteller, many of the stories that I've heard you and seen you tell are stories of resistance. They're stories of people often working against big, intense forces in the world. My favorite, which I'll put a little plug for, is the story of Art and Peggy Gish, Christian peacemakers, and a film, Old Radicals, that you made about their life of incredible witness and resistance. So I'm curious, as you engage this season, as someone who cares deeply about story and about the life of faith, what are you looking at and paying attention to? And as you reflect on some of these figures in Scripture, I know that the company that you make films with your partner under is called Noonday Films, and I know that comes in part from the verse in Isaiah, this anticipation of this noonday. So I want to ask you about that generally, and then I want to kind of say it's quite a year to anticipate a noonday. It feels awful dark. And so how are you leaning into that a bit? What do you want to add to the conversation?
Well, those are great questions. Yeah, I would say that all the stories I tell are in some way about resistance. And I think a lot of that just has to do with who I am. I tend to resist things in general. I'm just a resistant person. But I'm the kind of person who likes to push, and especially when I see any kind of injustice in any form, I just can't rest until I have done something, spoken out, to push back. It's interesting you bring up the title of the film company, because when my partner and I first started creating documentary many years ago, when we were, young, starry-eyed, idealistic filmmakers, I remember the conversation where this came up. Actually, we had just left a documentary called Darwin's Nightmare, which left us feeling very hopeless. It was a very powerful film, but also just a very dark film about about the environmental aspect of change in the world, and how humans in particular have affected the world around us. And we left and we thought, that was an amazing film, but we don't want to create films. We don't want to create documentaries that leave people feeling like this, because it was such a helpless feeling. And we said, we want to create stories that find the light that's breaking out in the midst of dark places. We want to find those voices of people who are doing something different in the midst of really hard things. So that the verse in Isaiah that speaks about that, about raising your voice for the voiceless, and about creating places of justice in places where there is injustice, and how you will become like the noonday, your light will shine like the noonday. That was the inspiration for the naming of our film company. And I think we have certainly done that. We have found those stories. Art and Peggy's story is an incredible story of that. I find it interesting because over the years, and as we have grown and changed, and as the world around us has changed in so many ways, this year, as you mentioned, is just a really hard year to see light. And it's funny, I was I was actually just recently looking back to the reference to that verse, and I did not realize that the next chapter in Isaiah, chapter 59, is almost the polar opposite. It's this other picture of things, and it's almost the exact parallel. It may even be the same. I think it's verse 10 or 11, but the word noonday comes up again, and it's the exact opposite. It's, you will stumble around at noonday as if it's twilight. And it's a depiction of this very dark, heavy time. And I saw that today as I was looking at just to check the reference, and I thought, oh, that's where we are now. That's the world we're in. Because it very much feels that way. It feels so dark. It feels as if we are stumbling around at noonday, trying to see where we're going sometimes. I live in Columbus, Ohio, as you mentioned, Matt, and it's a tough, living in the American Midwest in 2020. It's different. It's different than many of the places where I have lived before, and it's dark. It's hard. There are some hard stories happening all around us all the time. I accompanied a friend today to the ICE office downtown because her grandfather was picked up this morning and is being detained and deported, and she wanted to take him his glasses and a change of clothes. And in Columbus, Ohio, I'm very involved with the immigration work here in our community, and with the immigrant community in general, improving Americans. So I'm bilingual, and a lot of the work that I've done here in Columbus, Ohio is very much about that. And here in Columbus, the ICE office is actually located on the 3rd floor of this gorgeous old building downtown. It's absolutely beautiful. And it's a luxury hotel, the downstairs and part of it. I really have no idea how this happened, that the office building of ICE is in this same building that the Levesque Hotel is. But because of COVID, I wasn't able to accompany her inside, and the guard asked me to wait downstairs. So I went downstairs, and I'm standing in the lobby of this gorgeous hotel. Everything is glittering, everything is golden. There's a giant Christmas tree right next to me. Music is playing, shiny packages underneath this tree. And I'm looking around and all I can think about is how this elegance and this prosperity and this beautiful wealth is literally, propping up this entire system of violence and oppression and separation of families that's happening, 2 floors above me. The last time I was in that building, I was accompanying a friend, and we went to his ICE check-in, and they detained him, and I had to call his wife and let her know that he wouldn't be coming home. And they deported him later that same week. So it's hard to see the light when this is the reality we live in. A young Black man in our community was shot in the back by police last week as he entered his own home holding a Subway sandwich. And we have, we marched again. It's been, many months since we were out on the streets, at least for me personally and my family, but my daughter and I went down to the State House again last weekend because this story just never ends. So your question, what does that mean for Advent? What does that mean for finding light? What does that mean for trying to see the light of noonday in the midst of this really dark night of the soul that I feel is all around us? That's a question I don't have an answer to. I have maybe some small answers because I think that's all we can do. For me, what that means is continuing to look for those stories of light, and looking for ways where my own resistance in my own way can break through and put some cracks in that darkness to let that light in. And I do that in every way that I can think of. That might mean in 2019 or 2020 during COVID-19, that might mean that I focus inward a lot more than I was before. I've been home with my family a lot more. I've been able to actually sit and create some I love to draw and paint, and I've been able to do more of that than I typically do because I can't be out there, filming the stories that I would want to be filming, or doing the more active, more public resistance that I gravitate towards. But it's been really good for me to center myself, and kind of find the things that bring me light in my own life. But it also means finding ways to create light in the lives of the people that I am connected to, in my own little ripples. I've been trying to reframe my thinking. I think I got into storytelling, into filmmaking, because my thinking has always been very, very big. It's been, I see this problem in the world and I have to go out and change the entire thing and fix all of it and tell everyone what's going on so that we can all join together and just tear down this oppressive system. And why are we not all doing this right now? And as I have grown over the years and changed the way that I approach storytelling and deepened it, I would say I've also changed my own approach and my own understanding of myself. And I have tried to view what I do and the way I move through life as more of my ripples in the water and what they can reach and what they're able to do. So I try to keep those ripples moving. Even though I can't always see where they're going, I just try to focus on my circles here and bring light into the circle and hope that that light can spill out in whatever way that might be. That might be through film, that might be just through the people that I interact with. Yeah, I also wanted to say, Megan, I loved what you said about Mary and the Magnificat. And every year around this time, I think about this many years ago when we had first moved here to Columbus. We live in a pretty low income, very high risk neighborhood. With some other, we moved here because of some other folks who wanted to create kind of an intentional community here and just look for ways to live life differently in this space. And through them, we found there was a young woman who we actually highlighted in an Advent music video we made with a friend of ours, Peter Legrand, and his musical group, Ordinary Time. They have a beautiful Advent album, and one of their songs, Emmanuel, we did a small video for that in which we highlighted this young Black girl who was 14 at the time and very pregnant as our Mary figure. And the whole thing takes place in our neighborhood here in Franklinton. And it's a beautiful depiction of just, it's kind of a heavy piece, but it also shows that there is some hope in the midst of all of this. So in the midst of this place, it's very subtle. It's very, I can put the link in the chat if you'd be interested in it, because it's a beautiful film, or a beautiful musical piece, the song that Peter and his friends created. And I really, everything we're talking about now is kind of making me think of that story, because this girl, I mean, this is a very real 14-year-old girl living in a really tough neighborhood, about to bring a child into the world. And she had this fire and spark inside of her that I think Mary probably had as well. So anyway, I will put that in the link. And yeah, I could just keep talking about story and justice and resistance for a long time. So I will stop now.
No, thank you, Elisa. And yeah, throw that link in. And someone asked about Old Radicals. I think you guys have a public link for that. Maybe throw that. And
and I'll just say, we actually created a short film that's 7 or 8 minutes long. That's a very condensed story of just Art and Peggy, which I think is what you're referring to. But there is a longer Old Radicals film, which we created using some money we had won through a festival because of that first one. So they both have the title Old Radicals, but there's a 45-minute version, which includes the stories of several other elderly activists. Their stories are all fascinating, but there is also a very short piece that is only, 8 minutes long. So if you do, I'll put a link in here, but you can also search it on Vimeo. If you search Old Radicals and Noonday Films, there are 2 with the same title.
Thank you. Thank you. And I mean, what a potent image to me of, the sort of shiny hotel lobby, right? With the decorated to the nines for Christmas that's really set to go. And then, taking the elevator stairs up to the ice office. What a contrast. Quite a contrast for us of this season. And really, I think the picture that we've grown into of Christmas in so many ways culturally is of that bright and shiny picture. And that's part of what I think we want to poke at in this discussion. Paul, I want to pivot to you now. You've been patient, and thank you. You, partly because you come at this, most of us do come at Christmas with a whole lot of consuming, and we are consumers. It's part of what it means to be a creature. But you have your life oriented really around producing in a way that I think situates and orients you differently to this season. So I want to give you a chance to just talk a little bit about that. You can add to any of the conversation we've had, of course, on the broader themes, but welcome your time.
Yeah, thanks, Matt, and thank you, Megan and Elisa, for your reflections. I'm speaking from South Surrey in southern coastal BC, which is a fairly affluent community that I find myself farming in. Unlike your neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio. So it's a very different context, and I thank you for bringing your community into this conversation, particularly those who are in particular pain right now with the death of Casey Goodman so recently. This is going to be a really hard December for them. Yeah, so we're farming here, and I want to highlight in terms of resistance. I feel like right now seeking out those who are out buying things, and we all are buying things even through this season of December of Advent. But I want to say first off that seeking out local producers of anything right now feels like an act of resistance. It's hard for a lot of folks, and very easy and tempting to buy everything with clicks of mouses, and to continue to keep heaping on support for big box retailers, for Amazon. That's the easiest way to navigate buying what we need to buy these days, for a lot of folk. So somehow shutting that loop of consumption and going out of your way to find ways to support the small retailers that you want to still be there when pandemic is not the urgent thing in our lives again. That's a huge act of resistance, and it's certainly a big challenge for all of us, for producers, consumers, and everyone to say, okay, there's got to be a different way to consume that doesn't keep benefiting those who are who don't need it right now. As far as so yes, we're producing food, and food is something that will always be in demand. People need to eat to live, and so in a lot of ways, farmers haven't suffered the same sort of challenges in pandemic times that other folks who are selling directly to folks. And I should say that everything we grow is being sold directly to people. We're not going through wholesale channels, and we're not we're not a large commodity producer that has no connection to the consumer. So people like me who are growing primarily for local direct to eater have been well positioned to be able to meet a demand, and that demand hasn't gone away. And if anything, it's intensified this season. Now, my season as a grower has sort of wound down now. We have a few things. We were talking about ferments before while you all were waiting in the waiting room, and I'm a pretty passionate fermenter of things. So I still have some ferments. If anyone wants to leave me a message in the chat, you can come to my farm and pick up some sauerkraut if you're in the area. But this isn't a sales pitch. Most of the food that we've grown has gone out to people, and in this winter season, seeking out local food can be a bit of a challenge. Even here on the West Coast, if you're in Columbus, Ohio, or if you're in Winnipeg or Calgary, finding local food that's in season options in December and January and February is not always that easy. I do have greens growing in an unheated greenhouse, and the kale is still alive and well and tastes better than ever right now in my yard. But that's not going to be a reality in Winnipeg or Ohio right now. So orienting your diet seasonally is a big step of resistance for winter time. It is year round because a lot of folks even in summer aren't all that conscious of it. And for a producer like myself, a food producer, making a living growing food on a smaller scale to feed a local community of people depends on people valuing seasonal eating, and if people didn't care, if they said, no, it doesn't really matter whether I eat seasonally, I'll eat what I want when I want, it would be pretty hard for me to sell what I grow, because I don't grow for wintertime for the market a whole lot. People could forget about me for several months and then remember about me, partway through the summer, and already I've been trying to sell them food in July, but oh yeah, it's August. Oh, where's that tomato? Well, I can't just depend on people remembering halfway through my growing season that I exist. So I'm grateful that people are orienting their diets around local seasonal eating, and it becomes more challenging for all of us to continue that into the winter and to keep that commitment, because winter food doesn't have the same pizzazz as tomatoes do in August, and people get a little weary of roots and cabbages and things like that at some point in the winter. As far as this summer on our farm, one of the things that I think we were seeing happening was the folks who were regulars at the market were very regular this summer, and in part that's because they weren't going out of town, they weren't taking holidays elsewhere, so developing our market's open once a week in our local neighborhood, and people come to the farm and they come into our old 90-year-old barn and where we've got everything displayed, and not going anywhere all summer meant that people really established quite a rhythm of coming every week, and new people started to come, and uh, we had lineups, which hasn't usually been an issue, and people, lined up down our driveway, waiting sometimes half an hour or 40 minutes to get into the barn, to buy some vegetables, and so I started to think about what was driving that. Aside from people not going anywhere, I think people were really hungering for something that felt real, when so much of their consumption and so much of their social connecting was being mediated electronically, and uh, going to a grocery store is one thing, but going to a little farm where you can chat with the folks who grew your food, and stand 6 feet apart from people in a lineup waiting to get into a barn, and have a conversation about what you're anticipating making with those tomatoes this week. It felt, I think, for a lot of people that was nourishing in a deeper way beyond their stomachs. It was nourishing them in a season that felt pretty, yeah, it wore away at a lot of people's mental health and resilience. And so this is one way to kind of feed that aspect of people's lives, and so people kept on coming back, and they were very hungry for that connection this season.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to welcome all of you who are participating. Please do pose comments for any of the three folk, or just open questions. We'd love to keep the conversation going. We started late, so we probably will take about another almost half hour. So we have time to discourse and have some questions. So feel free to put those in the chat. I have lots that I can continually generate questions for our panelists here, so no problem there. One thing I would love to engage is how we think about this. Megan, you started by talking about the Christmas calendars, which my children are 100% socialized now to expect, right? This is give me the chocolate. And then the argument is when in the day they get to eat the chocolate. But I would love, perhaps with you, but all of you, how do you think about engaging families around this practice? I will tell a small tale on you, Megan, in that your family has inspired ours into doing a fast this Advent, where we're trying to live, I'm not here at the office, but at home, trying to live without artificial light. And that's based on an electricity fast that your family did a number of years ago. You're doing something similar now. And I know when I asked you about it, you said, actually, the kids are now driving it. They're sort of, it's ignited something in them. I'm curious, how would you, I'm sure there's other folk listening who would think, how do we engage children around this season? So what might you offer on that? And then Elisa and Paul, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, for me, there's been, fasting is so interesting, and often was, oh, well, I'll fast from chocolate or something like this. And for me, that didn't get to the heart of what is actually getting in the way of my relationship with God, my relationship with the creation, my relationship with each other. And our community and our family tries to observe that longer 40-day fast for Advent and for Lent. And so we wanted to explore, what would it look like to actually take seriously addressing our footprint on this earth for a bit? What would it look like to live in a similar way that so many people in our world actually do live, and actually here in Canada on reservations, where light or water for that matter aren't a given. And so the most intense of our electricity fasts did mean no hot water, no lights, no fridge, all of those things. we did have heat because we share our house with someone else who was not quite ready. And we are so grateful for her for that, not wanting to give up the heat. And it was amazing for us because it began to transform how we understood how we lived, even how architecture is built in terms of how much light is let in. But also when my children, when we talked about what we would do, last year we did a plastic fast, which was another, Paul, you were saying about how do we actually support our local people. And that was such a wake-up call as I, last minute, no lunches for the kids, and walking around a supermarket thinking, everything is plastic. I can't even get a head of lettuce that's not wrapped in plastic. What have we done? And so, but this year when we talked about the fast, and we talked about the electricity fast again, my son said, the reason we need to do this is that we actually have time again as a family. And so the very things that we think in terms of screen times and kids just wanting those screen times, and that is true most of the time, but actually under that is a deep hunger for relationship, for connection, for time spent together. And turning off the lights, leaving the screens at work, have been an act of resistance against a culture that says, no, you need to be available all the time. And it's been a beautiful, beautiful glimmer of light in this Advent season for us.
Thank you. Others want to comment on engaging the season with families and children and broader communities, perhaps? Let me just follow up then with you, Elisa. Knowing a little bit about the community, you mentioned being part of a community, some intentional community in your neighborhood, but also I know a church community there in Columbus. And I think part of this experience, and I do, let me just say also, I appreciate your juxtaposing these two images of the noonday, both as a brightness, but also as the noonday. I have a spiritual director who talks about a noonday sun as disorienting, because you can't tell which direction to move in. It's directly above you, and it's sort of, everything loses orientation. And it strikes me that part of the experience of this year with COVID, there has been a disorientation. And Paul's talking about people hungering for connection, et cetera. We're sort of tapping into that. What might you say about your own community, and as it relates to seeking to care for each other, but also perhaps as it relates to this notion of resistance? Could you just say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. I know someone put the question in the chat too about the intentional community as resistance, and I feel like I've misled a tad bit. So when we originally moved here, we moved here because there was an intentional community in this neighborhood, and we were hoping to connect with that. That's not something that really lasted in that same way. It has changed, it has evolved. There's definitely still tendrils of that intentional community around us. But I would not say that we live in an intentional community now. We are very intentional in our lives and in the people we connect with. But yeah, what was here before is not quite the same. However, out of that, and because of that community that we moved into here in our neighborhood, there are definitely some really strong things that have happened that were established because of connections with the folks that were here as a part of that community. So we have the two biggest things that I think of are these two organizations that were started that are going very strong to this day. This community is in this neighborhood is an urban food desert. There's nowhere nearby to get fresh food and vegetables. Especially for folks who don't have transportation, it's very difficult to get to the grocery store. Our public transit system in Columbus, as in many places in the United States, is not effective or efficient or all that useful. So because of that, we have Franklinton Farms. It began as Franklinton Gardens and was just a group of folks friends of ours who started gardening and trying to grow some vegetables on empty lots. A lot of empty lots in our neighborhood where houses have been foreclosed, burnt down. It's that kind of a neighborhood, and that has now grown to Franklinton Farms, which is very large and providing fresh produce for our community in really remarkable ways. It's a very successful organization. Also, Franklinton Cycle Works is a fabulous organization. They're just around the corner from us, and they have a bike shop where they not only sell used bikes and parts, but they also provide a lot of training and skills for folks that may need to do work on their own bikes if that's their only form of transportation. As I mentioned, that's a big issue for our low-income neighborhood, but also providing skills that can be used in future job opportunities and even hiring folks from our neighborhood. So those are some really concrete ways that our community and our friends have done some remarkable things around here. As far as our church, oh, thank you. Somebody linked to Franklinton Farms. Wonderful. Yes, our church community that we're a part of, we attend the Columbus Mennonite Church. And our church has been really a fantastic source of inspiration for me personally, and has done a lot of good in our community as far as looking for ways to transform not only I think I'm trying to be cautious not to use language of just external transformation, because one of the things that most impresses me and one of the reasons we are actually at this church is because of the internal transformation that they're so focused on. So when we first began attending, their whole ordinary time was all focused on Black Lives Matter. And it was a very intentional exploration. It's a majority white church, pretty well-to-do church. And they're very aware of that and talk about that a lot, which I appreciate. One of the things that we do there and have been doing now for over 3 years is we provide sanctuary for a friend of mine whose name is Edith Espinal. I want to say it in Spanish, Edith Espinal. And she has been living in sanctuary at our church for over 3 years now. ICE has attempted to deport her and has continued to attempt to deport her ever since she moved into the church. You may have seen her on the news because she received a $500,000 fine from ICE for staying in the church and not reporting for deportation. That was on the front page of the New York Times last year, I believe, or 2 years ago. So her story and the work that we do around her has been really formative for our church community as a whole. And it's been a sanctuary in every sense of the word, has become a real focus of our work as a church. So yeah, those are some of the communities that we're connected to that I believe are looking for ways to resist the darkness.
Thank you very much. Paul, perhaps one more question for you, and that is one of the things I'm hearing you talk about, and we've talked outside of this conversation about this this market that your farm has hosted and the sort of overwhelming growth of it through this year, and it strikes me that that COVID has kind of slowed us down. It's made us pay attention a little bit differently, and I think both to some really positive things and some really negative things that are in our midst. And in a way that I think is one of the invitations of the Advent season as well, right? To sort of repace ourselves, reorient ourselves, resituate ourselves in a different story. And I was wondering, one of the things, Megan has helpfully, I think, talked about that, the sense of fasting, the sense of prayer, of reorientation. Sometimes we can hear that with a negative tone. Oh, I got to give something up. I know several friends said, I'm not fasting at all this Advent. I feel like I'm living a fast. But I saw, Paul, you recently shared some photos of a bike ride you took on a Sabbath, that perhaps what we need actually isn't to give things up, but to add something in, to re-engage. I wonder if you want to share a little bit about that, and then open that up to all of you as you think about what might we want to add. Is there an invitation to some joy actually in this season as well? I got to unmute yourself, Paul.
Done. Sorry about that. Farming is a very, very focused season, an extended time of the year when paying attention to land and crops and the physical work of that takes over a lot of your attention. And so Advent kind of coincides with a real shift for me in life, and I find that every year around this time I have new energy to take up new practices. Incidentally, I didn't jump in fast enough here, but my family's been reading every day this chapters from this book. I don't know if you've run across it, All Creation Waits. I recommend you look that up. Somebody could stick it in the chat. But it kind of talks about animals like me, or animals, not unlike me, a farmer, have a very active season and then a season that's a lot quieter. I do not hibernate in winter. I don't feel like it's the best thing for me to totally shut down my metabolism and not get out of bed. I like to try to remain active, and my activity isn't around producing things in winter, or at least I try to kind of reorient myself not around producing, and and so going for a bike ride. Most winters I try and get to my local pool for swims, because I find that really refreshing and life-giving, and it engages all my muscles, and I can kind of shut off my mind and just go back and forth for a long time. And I find that really recharges me well. My pool's not open right now, and so going for swims. I've been trying several times a week to do yoga right here in this living room, and I find that combination of kind of slowing down, focusing on my breath, and I mean the physical aspect of the kind of trying to keep my body limber when I'm not as physically active, so that when I need my body to be there for me again in spring for planting season, things haven't totally atrophied. That's important for me. But just slowing down and breathing, and remaining active in ways that's just more about nurturing myself, and not trying to stay busy just for the means of making and producing and being producing food for people. It's a different kind of focus. I noticed a couple of other questions here. Some are answered already. Thank you for answering that. This has been my 16th year farming with the Rocha, and it's been a great journey. I'm just winding down with the Rocha and refocusing to producing food on the property that I live on now, alongside my wife. So those are the references there. Somebody asked about ways of building local resilient food systems, and you've got good suggestions there. There's lots of CSA farms. There's lots of farms that this year have turned to other models of delivering food to people, not just CSAs, but home delivery that's coming more directly from local farms, as opposed to some of the Blue Apron and other online meal services, which are not local particularly. And getting to know which I mean, even some small local farm stand or produce markets are more aware of orienting their buying around local producers. So kind of asking those questions at your local grocery stores and trying to figure out which stores are more oriented in that way is helpful. And of course, yeah, growing your own is really an important. Not everyone has a space to grow their own in, and I do I mean, I remind people that getting your hands in the soil doesn't mean you have to have a big garden or any garden. If you live somewhere where you can put a pot out on a balcony, even just having one basil plant that you can pluck leaves off of and add into the food that you're purchasing from other places can remind you that of the joys of local eating. And it doesn't totally change the food system, but it changes your own orientation to the food system. So, yeah.
Thank you. That's super helpful. I want to perhaps in the bit of the time we have left, I want to cycle back a little bit. And this is partly for you, Megan, but others as well can jump in with where we began. And you really helped us to think about some of the main characters in the story leading up to Christmas. One of the questions here ties into that, I think, helpfully. It says, when Jesus came into the world, it was quiet, a small group, Mary, Joseph, the three wise folk, plus animals. Perhaps speak to the benefits of having a more quiet or small celebration, which many of ours will be in 2020. But I guess the more broad question around that, which I'd love to pose, is, part of what we are doing when we engage the liturgical year is beginning to see ourselves in this story, right? Beginning to see that the way that God has come and interacted with these folk is indeed the way that God is present and interacting with us, and finding ourselves in that story. So maybe give you a chance to, if you want to come back on that more generally, and then perhaps thinking particularly about this year where the fact that we are so isolated and separated and we don't get to celebrate in quite the ways we want. I know that part of your work is, the pastoral care of a whole congregation, many of whom are isolated and they're not seeing one another. I'll give you a chance to say a little bit about some of that.
Thank you. And I think all three of us have spoken a little bit to that, the focus on an internal work, that internal transformation. And I think what has been in some ways the blessing of this time is an understanding, maybe for the first time, or a renewed sense of placing ourselves a little bit more closely to the story as it might have been. I remember when for us, Holy Week was our first, into online for Holy Week. And how do you live that? How do you embody that in an online way? And then to wake up on Easter Sunday and have to proclaim the resurrection from our living room, and to realize that actually that was closer than anything we'd ever done. That the uncertainty and the fear and the confusion and the longing to be with people, actually that was more in line with that first Easter morning. And again, as we now move through Advent and into Christmas, to walk actually with Mary and Joseph in that uncertain journey down Galilee into Jerusalem, to walk with them in the confusion of not having a place to go, to give birth by yourself when you would have given birth with your family, with a whole community surrounding you, and to know that that's the experience of so many families across the world right now. That actually we're closer than ever to some of the essence of these ancient stories that are actually coming to life in new ways in this year. And I think to hold that and to know that there is an invitation deeply into that, to take that to heart, to walk walk this closely this year, even if it has to be different. And maybe especially to see in that an invitation to see it newly, I guess.
Thank you. One of the things that we that the community that Megan and I are a part of together at the Abbey Church is to put together a set of stations. Often there's stations of the cross, but this is a set of stations around Advent with some art and some images and some prompts really for prayer and reflection. And if you are in Greater Victoria, a few of you are on the call, I know, you can go and walk. It's set, it has lights on it. You can do it 24 hours a day here at the parish of St. Matthias out in the side yard. I also, however, we have all of these images. I'm going to upload a PDF and I'll give a link in the chat, since many of you are spread far and wide, that it would be an invitation to engage a story differently, even through images that come up on your computer screen. Are there anything you want to add to that, Elisa or Paul, in terms of beginning to see ourselves in some of this old story in this very different of sorts of years?
I would just say I'm part of the worship commission at our church. We've been obviously doing all Zoom church since March. And one of the things we discussed earlier today in our meeting was communion and whether or not we should continue doing communion over Zoom the way we have been doing. And the one thing that I brought up was, you know, it gets very chaotic in our house. I don't know how your houses are, but I've got 3 kids. And Sunday mornings, when you're just gathering around a screen for church, especially when it involves preparing something and bringing something with you, can get a little crazy. So we sometimes, end up with like a cracker and a cup of chocolate milk, but whatever. My point was, we need to continually remember that even that is holy. And it may not be the thing that we're used to. It may not feel the same as walking into a sanctuary and, being handed a goblet or having someone say these words over you. But those moments, even though they're so different and they feel so chaotic sometimes, and you feel like maybe you're not doing things quite right, those are still holy moments. And there's something about them and about carving out space for them that is sacred. And that might look different, and it will look different this year, but it's still there. It's still a part of who we are and the experience that we're choosing for ourselves and for our loved ones who are with us. So just keep carving out those holy spaces.
Thank you, Elisa.
To jump off on what Elisa was just saying, I do notice, like in our community's been doing Zoom services as well, and we try to make them as intergenerational as we can. But I notice that especially as time has gone on, the kids are less and less wanting to be a part of that. Certainly that's the case for my older kids, my teenagers, but it's harder for them to be motivated to connect on a screen in a Zoom context. So yeah, I feel like our celebration of the advent of Christ has to happen in a small way around our own table, in whatever creative way we as families can engage our kids at the ages and levels they're at, because they're getting much less Advent content coming to them through our worship in our local worshiping community context this year compared to previously. So yeah, it kind of ups the responsibility a little bit, that I feel, for sure. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, we are really at our time here, so I want to sort of draw us to a close. I want to first thank our 3 panelists. Thank you, Elisa and Paul and Megan, for being part of this rich discussion, bringing your stories and your life and your witness of the work that you're doing, all in different ways, but such a rich tapestry of overlapping meaning. So thank you all. I want to thank all of our participants who are here on the call. Those of you who will be watching this later, you will be receiving, I think you may have already been received, if you registered for this, a short evaluation, an opportunity to provide some feedback to Rocha. We thank you for supporting the work of Rocha. Help us improve this online programming. And there will be a recording of this made available in the coming days. There'll be a link to that. It goes up on our YouTube page. So if you have friends or others who are interested, oh, I wonder what you did there, this will be a dialogue that will be made public and can happen. The last thing I'll just announce, we are going to be taking a break in January, but we have a talk that will be coming up at some point, probably later in February, with Dr. Carmody Gray, who is a theologian at the University of Durham in the north of England, and some of her work around climate, around faith and environment. She's going to be interviewed by Dr. Jason Biasi at the Vancouver School of Theology, who's now a new Rocha Canada board member. So that'll be a rich conversation, and these will be ongoing. So please do check back on us, check the emails that'll be coming out, invitations to think more broadly. And just as we close, let me send you all with the blessing of God that comes to meet us on the road that extends before us in unexpected places, that is with us in the darkness of night and the breaking light of day, even the disorienting light of the noonday. And so may God, the love of God, be with you all as you go forth this night. Thank you for being with us. Thanks for joining with us.